As promised, I'm going to be telling you about some applications of network centrality that I actually did myself. The first is a hospital patient transfer network. There are thousands of transfers between hospitals in the United States, and my colleague Jack Iwashnia was doing this study based on Medicare records. So people who are on Medicare, who constitute roughly half to 60% of these transfers, when they transfer between hospitals, there's a record of it, and he was analyzing this data set. It makes for a very pretty network, but it also highlights a potential problem, and that is that there are these highly resistant bacteria that sometimes take hold in hospitals, and because of their drug resistance, it's very, very difficult to treat patients who acquire these infections, and it's actually rather costly, right? Because your first line of defense, the antibiotic, will not work. And there's some documented evidence that patient transfers have led to also transfers of these bacteria who were hitching a ride with the patients when going to a new hospital. Now, pretty much it's each hospital trying to prevent these infections on their own. So measures that they can take, for example, are keeping an incoming patient in a separate area, and when someone enters this area, they have to be wearing masks, they have to wear gloves, they have to follow protocol. Of course, this actually costs quite a bit of money. So the question is, could you formulate more effective infection prevention strategies if the hospitals could actually coordinate within this network and pool their resources and put prevention resources at hospitals where the total number of infections across all hospitals would be minimized if you did the allocation correctly. Now, what we assumed was that the more resource a hospital has, the less likely it is to acquire an infection. But once it's infected, it can't really root out such an infection, and it will actually be sending along infected patients to neighboring hospitals. So, one solution, of course, would be to forbid all patient transfers. However, there are many benefits to such transfers, starting from some hospitals being overbooked. Their intensive care unit can't take any more patients, and so they transfer to a second hospital, or a hospital doesn't have the needed expertise and a neighboring hospital does. And in general, patient outcomes are better when patients who need to be transferred are transferred. So we really do just want to allocate some prevention resources as opposed to, shutting down whole hospitals or something like that, or forbidding transfers. So there are different strategies that you could use. You could just allocate money at random. And here what this shows is what the number of infections would look like after a year, and so you can see that there are really some hotspots, some hospitals that would have been very likely to be infected if an infection started at any random hospital. So you say, well, okay, we know that some hospitals have more transfers than others, and so we tried a strategy that would target those hospitals with high degree. And here, we have the choice of in degree and out degree. Some hospitals receive more patients, some hospitals send more out. And what we found was most effective was to take the geometric mean, that is the in degree times the out degree, and the square root of that quantity. And you can see that this produces a significant reduction in infection rates. However, we also know about betweenness, right? And we know that if a hospital is sort of bridging, say, the East and West Coast, then being able to, target those hospitals that are kind of between a lot of other hospitals, that might be even more effective. And indeed it is. When you target based on betweenness as opposed to degree, you reduce infections even further. And finally, what is most effective is actually simulating the infection spread and running a greedy algorithm to see which hospitals should be targeted. And these typically are high degree and high betweenness hospitals, but you can do even better by simulating in this greedy manner. And a collaborator of mine at CMU, Aditya Prakash, actually showed that an eigenvector approach was most effective. It was a really good approximation to this greedy algorithm. And so we kind of ran the full gamut from degree to betweenness to eigenvector in solving this problem. Of course, I'm saying solving, it's kind of solved in theory, of course, from a practical policy standpoint. It's not clear how you would get hospitals at a national level to pool resources, but still it's an interesting thing to consider if there are, for example, federal funds that can be allocated between different hospitals. The second example I've already mentioned a little bit when we were talking about preferential attachment and scale-free networks, and this was identifying expertise in online question and answer forums. And the reason why we may want to identify expertise is that there's this response time gap between when an expert asks a question in Sun's Java forum, they may be waiting for hours or days, but when a newbie asks a question, their question is answered right away. And the question is, could you speed this up by matching experts with questions that were posed by experts in order to get those taken care of sooner? And so what we did was we gathered a whole lot of data from Sun's Java forum, and we had 200,000 users and 800,000 edges, so plenty to play with. But with real world data, the thing is always you have to decide how you're going to construct the network. So you could construct it in an unweighted way. What we wanted to do was have, for example, if you have A who posted 2 questions, and then you have B and C who answered those questions, you have some choice. You could, for example, do an unweighted network where A has directed edges to B and C, and in this case, we're saying B is more expert than A because they could answer the question. We could weigh the edges by the number, or weight the edges, sorry, by the number of threads that the 2 nodes interacted in. We could have them share credit, so if both B and C answered a question, they would each get half weight 1/2 added to whatever other weight they had. Or we could even introduce a little bit of backflow, and this just means if you asked a question that was answered, it means that at least it was sort of a decent question. So we may have a little bit of the weight of the edge going back. Now, as I mentioned before, there's very uneven participation, especially when we look at nodes that post lots and lots of replies. And in addition to looking at these kind of individual node centralities, we can look at the whole structure of the network. And something that I haven't really discussed before is the bowtie model of the web. It's very simple. You have the strongly connected component. Remember, on the web, this means that you could actually, if you're very patient and kept clicking, get from one page to any other within that component. And then you have the in component. From this component, you can start on a web page and end up in the strongly connected component, but you can't get back out. The out component means that you can get out of the strongly connected component into this region, but you can't get back in, and then kind of other sorts of structures. And what's true of the web is that this at least a decade or more ago, was that you had this very symmetric bow tie. And the symmetry is not there. It's very skewed in Sun's Java forum because, well, you do have a strongly connected component, but it's actually relatively small. Only about 12% are interacting in such a way that they're all kind of helping each other in a generalized reciprocity kind of way. So maybe A didn't A replied to B, and B didn't reply directly to A, but B replied to C, who replied to D, etc. You have a large in component. These are people who are asking questions but not necessarily replying, or if they do reply, they didn't reply to someone in here, and so they all compose this in component. And there's a small out component. These are people who only answer but don't ask. Okay, but back to the question of centrality. As I mentioned before, it was very clear, that some nodes were very active, very central. But what we wanted to know was whether indeed degree was the best way to capture centrality. And so in order to evaluate, we had human raters read the posts and judge the expertise level of the repliers. And what we found was actually a very high correlation over a number of centrality metrics between the human rated expertise and just this, whatever centrality measures we were deriving. And so in a way that was nice because you basically couldn't mess up. You could use any measure and do really well. But what was disappointing to us was that PageRank was not the clear winner. And the reason why we had hoped that PageRank would be, a good centrality measure is if you think about it, if someone is expert enough to answer the question of another expert who themselves has been helping others, then that kind of propagation should tell us that this expert is so much better than this other expert, etc. So the recursion thing just apparently wasn't working in this forum. So we wanted to know why, and we did look at the breakdown of the human rating versus the kind of centrality measures we were getting, and that wasn't really telling us why PageRank wasn't performing all that awesomely. And then Jun Zhang built a simulator. So from last week, you may be familiar with, hey, sometimes just simulating how a network forms can give you insights into whether you understand the dynamics that are leading to the network, right? And the dynamics may be really the things that you're actually after. And so here the parameters were who's going to ask more often. Is it going to be the newbies or the experts? And the one that seemed to resemble more the real network, just because of the skew, was that newbies ask lots and lots of questions. And then who is going to answer whom? We wanted to have a particular matching algorithm. And so in one case, we had the best preferred. That is, no matter what the expertise of the person asking, the expert who has the most difference in expertise, that is, they're as expert as possible over what is being asked, is going to answer. And we had another model, which was the just better model, so that people who are answering would be choosing to answer questions that would be challenging to them. So if a newbie asks a question, then just the people who are a little bit more expert than newbies would be answering the newbie questions. And the top level experts would kind of save their bandwidth and only answer the questions of those who are like almost as expert as they were. And this actually led to two different kinds of topologies. In the best preferred network, you can see, so this is a circle layout where I've just ordered the nodes by the expertise that we assign them in the simulation. And you can see a lot of the questions are answered by the experts. And also, so here they're shown as larger nodes. They're more central in the network. Here with the just better, you can see that the twos are answering the ones, the threes are answering the twos, etc. And in fact, you have that the experts are kind of being pushed to the periphery of the network. And so it makes sense. So it makes sense that when we look at algorithm performance, that if the underlying dynamic is this, the best guys are always answering, which is in fact what we see, right? They're not actually discriminating, then things such as in degree or kind of z-scores of in degree, how much higher is the degree than what you would expect at if you had a balanced in-out degree for the different nodes, that should perform better. And so we kind of figured out what the underlying dynamics were by seeing which algorithms perform well. On the other hand, in the just better simulation, if people really were mindful of their bandwidth and matching their expertise to the level of the question, then in fact we would see here PageRank is in yellow, that the PageRank algorithm would be the one that is most predictive. So, and I haven't discussed the hits ranking algorithm. It's also kind of a web ranking algorithm. But it's just to illustrate, there are lots and lots of different centrality measures. So in hits, the basic definition is that you have hubs and authorities. Hubs are going to link to or point to authorities, and authorities are pointed to by good hubs, right? So you have this kind of bimodal definition, and you're going to iterate again some matrix computations. And in this case, we can figure out that if you had the just better model, a hits algorithm would not perform very well at all, because most of the questions are being asked by the newbies. They're the hubs, but their questions would be answered by the barely experts, right? So you would get the barely experts being ranked highest by the hits algorithm. And so we can sort of predict the hits algorithm wouldn't work in this context versus the PageRank algorithm would. And so this is just to say that you have many, many different choices of centrality measures, and sometimes it's nice to throw in the kitchen sink and see what works. If you were a social scientist, you may try several different centrality measures and you stick them into a big regression where you're trying to figure out, what specific outcomes do you care about? For example, if it's a person's well-being, does their degree centrality matter more than their betweenness centrality? If you're looking at an online community, who's going to stay active in the community? Does it matter how many contacts they have? Or does it matter that they're actually bridging different communities? For example, if they have high betweenness, what you might expect is that if one community or one subset of people starts being less active in that community, they would still have another that could potentially still be active. But on the other hand, if it's really high betweenness, they may just be bridging different groups without really finding a home in that online community. So they might be more likely to quit. So the thing is, you don't know ahead of time. Just as with the Java forum, we expected PageRank to perform well, and it didn't actually perform any better. It was actually slightly worse than just looking at these z-scores of in degree versus out degree. And that's a little bit of the magic of doing, especially exploratory social network analysis, that you can go in with the standard set of centrality measures, and then you really think about the problem. You really think, how can I capture, for example, with expertise, maybe it's not so much how much you answer, but do you answer a lot more than you ask, right? It sort of makes sense, right? You're sort of clueful. Maybe that's a better measure. And so, it does contribute to the problem of there being lots and lots of different centrality measures, but I also think, practically speaking, it's good to customize. And you can always use the standard ones, but sometimes if you're thinking deeply about your problem, you may come up with something new and different and interesting. So in the next video, I'll be talking about how to fit power laws properly. I consider this video optional because you know, it's going to be a little bit technical, but if you're ever going to claim that you have a scale-free network, you must watch this video and learn how to fit power laws properly, because I don't want you running around making false statements after taking my class. Okay, so I'll see you maybe in the next video then.